A former MI6 officer has told Sky News that some of Russia's leaders believe they're at war with the UK and they interfered with the Brexit and Scottish referendum campaigns. In his first British TV interview, Christopher Steele, the former spy behind a controversial dossier alleging collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, says there's growing Russian hostility to Britain. He's concerned the threat isn't being taken seriously enough. This exclusive report from our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes.
He's the former British spy who accused Donald Trump of colluding with Russia. Now, Christopher Steele is breaking cover with a warning about the threat he thinks Moscow poses to the UK and Europe.
I mean, there are serious people at the top of Russia who regard themselves at war with us. And the fact that our politicians neither want to recognise or deal with that is a big problem.
Did you ever uncover any evidence of hostile Russian operations against the UK?
Yes. Everything from corrupt leadership money being brought on shore and invested in strategic industries and the like, which is something of concern, to potential attempts to fund parts of the Brexit campaign and interference in that, Scottish referendum, some evidence of interference in that as well.
And what sort of evidence?
I don't have it to hand, but clearly some of the same playbook that we saw, so money being moved through deniable channels and coming out the other end technically legal. There was a whole load of loopholes.
It was Steele's work on another historic vote that made global headlines. In his first British TV interview, the former MI6 officer defended his unverified dossier that accused Russia and the Trump campaign of collusion in the 2016 US election.
How much of this is real, do you think?
I think the vast majority of it's real.
What can you say about the credibility of your sources?
We were pretty confident that the majority of the sources were highly reliable, and others were certainly moderately to highly reliable.
Trump has said it's all false. The UK's previous national security advisor said ministers are alive to the Russia threat.
Every senior politician I've dealt with, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, whatever, takes any threat of this kind really seriously. They take national security seriously. They worry about the impact on the democratic process. They're right to do so.
After his dossier became public, Steele claimed he may even have been targeted by Russian agents while on holiday with his wife.
Curiously, it was in my wife's sponge bag, 2 wedding rings, one male, one female, which were planted in her sponge bag in our bathroom in our luxury high security hotel in the Caribbean.
And what do you think the message was?
We know where you are, we can get to you, don't think you're able to hide from us.
He's not trying to hide, but he hopes his warnings on Russia will be heeded. Deborah Haynes, Sky News.
And you can see a longer version of Deborah's special report featuring Christopher Steele at 9:30 on Sky News Breakfast and throughout the day here on Sky News. Alec Baldwin was handed a loaded weapon by an assistant director who said it was safe to use by calling out "cold gun" moments before the actor killed a cinematographer on his film set. Court documents show the assistant director didn't know the prop gun was loaded with live rounds. Baldwin says he's cooperating with police as they investigate exactly what happened. Sky's US correspondent Greg Milam has this report from Los Angeles, which does contain some flash photography.
They are chilling details of what happened in those critical moments at the Bonanza Creek Ranch when a Hollywood shootout turned into a deadly, real-life tragedy. Dressed in full costume, as in this picture he'd posted before the incident, court documents have revealed Alec Baldwin was handed a loaded weapon by a crew member. Cold gun, they'd called, indicating they were unaware it contained live rounds. A single shot to the chest killed cinematographer Helena Hutchins and wounded director Joel Souza.
Bonanza Creek Road. We have a people that were shot accidentally.
The investigation into that shooting continues. Baldwin, photographed looking distraught shortly after the incident, says he's heartbroken. In a statement, the actor said, "There are no words to convey my shock and sadness regarding the tragic accident that that took the life of Helena Hutchins, a wife, mother and deeply admired colleague of ours. I'm fully cooperating with the police investigation to address how this tragedy occurred, and I'm in touch with her husband, offering my support to him and his family. My heart is broken for her husband, their son, and all who knew and loved Helena. 2 days ago, she'd posted this video, the perks of filming a Western, she'd said, riding on your days off. Born in Ukraine and raised on a Soviet base in the Arctic, she was named a rising star of the movie business. Her loss is devastating to friends.
She has this, tremendous talent is a given, but her human connection was incredible. And I think in the film industry, which is extremely competitive, this is where it's really important to have this human connection.
It's been reported that before the incident, several crew members had walked off the set over safety concerns, including misfires of a prop gun. The movie's producers say they weren't made aware of any official complaints concerning weapon or prop safety, but would review procedures. Safety, they said, was their top priority. Alec Baldwin was a co-producer of the film as well as its star.
I can't even imagine what Alec Baldwin is going through. You go to work, you're an actor, you're pretending to play someone who fires a gun, and then all of a sudden real life kicks in and you have fired a gun that has fatally injured your cinematographer and injured your director.
Last week, a picture of the cast receiving a safety briefing was posted. This incident is raising serious questions in an industry that says safety around firearms on set is number one on its list of priorities. If that's the case, how could something like this happen? That is the focus for investigators too. For many, though, it is the loss of a woman, described as always smiling, always hopeful, a ray of light. Greg Milam, Sky News, Los Angeles.
In the last few hours, Helena Hutchins' husband, Matt, has tweeted, "Helena inspired us all with her passion and vision, and her legacy is too meaningful to encapsulate in words. Our loss is enormous, and we ask that the media please respect my family's privacy as we process our grief. We thank everyone for sharing images and stories of her life." Half-term has begun for many children across England and Wales, and scientists are hoping the holiday could act as a firebreak for the large number of infections in schools. Meanwhile, the focus is now on the booster campaign. Our correspondent, Elena Veselinovic, is here now with the details. School's out, but with cases rising in school-aged children, what are the hopes for this break, Melina?
Well, it's hoped that when kids mix a little bit, can act as a break in transmission, because currently COVID rates among children have hit a record high. And when it comes to inoculating 12 to 15-year-olds, now that's been quite sluggish. The vaccines for that age group have been available since the 20th of September, but only about 1 in 5 of those children in England have been inoculated so far. Now, the rollout has been happening through schools up to now, but since last night, parents can actually book an appointment at a vaccination centre, and that is hoped it could encourage take-up. Because these high case rates, while with children, COVID is thankfully mainly a mild illness, it does disrupt education. It also acts as a vector for transmission into older age groups. And that is particularly concerning now with really surging case rates across the country and as we come into winter. And there's also been issues with a booster rollout as well. We've had data that shows that fewer than half of all elderly care home residents have got that third shot so far, even though they're eligible. We've also heard complaints from some people that they haven't got their invitation for the booster yet. But what the government says is that if it's been more than 6 months since your second dose, don't wait for an invitation, just book your booster and go get it done.
Thank you. Well, let's take a look at the latest COVID figures now. More than 49,000 new cases have been reported in the UK in the last 24 hours. Another 180 people have died, taking the total number of people who've died within 28 days of a positive test to 139,326. More than 48,000 people have received their first dose of a COVID vaccine, and over 26,000 have had their second dose. That brings the total number of people who are now fully vaccinated to 45.5 million. Let's speak now to Dr. Simon Clarke, a microbiologist at the University of Reading. Dr. Clarke, thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning, Sarah.
Has the half-term break come at exactly the right time in terms of cases?
I think it probably has. I expect it to give us some respite in terms of numbers. It will remove an opportunity for spread that is schools, but of course it'll only last a week, and we'll see a drop in numbers, I think. And then I think it will probably start to pick back up again as we move into later autumn and the winter.
If we look to Scotland, half-term was earlier there. They peaked before us. Their numbers are now reducing much lower than ours. But they are further ahead with the vaccine rollout in teenagers, aren't they? What lessons can we learn?
Well, I think the vaccine rollout, particularly with teenagers, is a lesson in infrastructure and organisation. And it does seem that some of that organisation that worked so well in England isn't there at the moment. And that's what the government needs to address. The same can be said of explaining to people and putting out to people how they can go about getting their jabs. I don't think that's there at the moment, and hasn't been with boosters either.
We had a warning yesterday from Professor Adam Finn on the JCVI that the vaccines alone are not the magic bullet, but there is a reluctance in government to address Plan B and the possibility of it at this stage, isn't there?
There is, and it seems a bit odd. I mean, we're not seeing that with other countries. And while I'm not sure international comparisons are terribly useful, it does appear that the government in this country, in England at least, are focused on the effects of COVID on the health service. And while that's important, I think it sort of misses what the effects that it can have on other sectors of the economy. We already see that there are supply chain problems in England and rest of the UK. I think if there were to be a mass sickness, and we did see it last year in certain sectors, particularly in food processing, then we could see those problems that we've already got exacerbated.
Can I ask you about this Delta Plus variant, the mutation of the Delta variant, potentially more transmissible than Delta? How concerned are you?
Well, I'm afraid I think this is only heading in one direction, to more and more transmissible strains. I remember 18 months ago, people said it would become more and more transmissible and less pathogenic. That means less and less able to cause disease. The first bit's happened, but the second one hasn't. I think it will only get more transmissible. That's what evolution really, I think, dictates should happen. But this particular variant, well, we think it's probably about 15% more transmissible. There's no indication of a change in its ability to cause disease, though.
And it is still at relatively low levels in the UK at the moment.
Yes.
But if you end up with a more transmissible variant, that places even more importance then on the booster rollout, doesn't it? And really getting people's immunity up.
It does, yes. It places greater strain. The more people you infect, the bigger problem you've got. And the boosters, but also if we are to move to imposing certain restrictions, they will need to come in a bit sooner, if indeed it is more transmissible.
And those kind of restrictions that you're talking about being what?
I think the government will move to face masks or face covering, will be one of the first things it does. But eventually it will have to bite the bullet, I think, and move to encouraging people to work from home where they can. And indeed, Sage highlighted that yesterday.
And what about the moving of the gap between doses 2 and 3, the booster, from 6 months to 5 months? Could that help, and is that feasible?
It's feasible. I don't really understand the science or the philosophy behind doing that. I think it's a case of something must be done. This is something, so let's do it. But what it does do, of course, is potentially reduce the time frame that you've got effective vaccination. If we were to have another wave in the spring of next year, we don't know whether boosted immunity or immunity that's boosted after 5 months will have started to wane before then. It may do, it may not.
OK, Dr. Simon Clarke, good to hear from you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Almost £7 billion is expected to be given to boost local transport schemes in cities outside London. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is set to unveil the new spending in Wednesday's budget as part of his levelling up agenda. A total of £6.9 billion is expected to be set aside for regions across England to improve local transport. It includes London-style improvements to bus services, expanding tram networks and upgrades to trains and stations. The government says it hopes it will improve commutes and reduce journey times. As part of the scheme, the Treasury says Greater Manchester will receive just over £1 billion to improve transport services. The West Midlands is also set to receive just over £1 billion. West Yorkshire will get £830 million and the Liverpool City region £710 million. South Yorkshire, Tees Valley and the West of England will also get a cash injection. But the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, said, as welcome as it is, infrastructure investment alone will not make levelling up feel real to the people of Greater Manchester. That will only happen when the frequency and coverage of bus services are increased and fares are lowered to London levels. Other experts are also sceptical.
What they're not announcing now is the massive sting in the tail, which is the cancellation of the eastern leg of HS2 and a big scaling down of the project to link up the northern cities from Liverpool and Manchester through to Bradford and Leeds and then Newcastle in the north of England.
I think this scheme feels like something that's been created in Westminster for Westminster. I think really the question is, why are we getting this kind of funding around the edges? And what we really need is a London-style system of public control where it works for local people and not just for profit.
Petrol prices are set to reach a new record high within days, according to new analysis from experts. The Petrol Retailers Association said they were almost certain fuel price records will be smashed before the end of next week. The AA says prices are being artificially inflated for profit. The US Supreme Court has allowed a Texas law that bans most abortions to remain in effect. But in a very unusual move, it's speeding up the process to hear challenges to it. The law means most women have to travel out of Texas to get an abortion, even in cases of rape. The arguments will be heard on November the 1st. Good morning. It's just after 7:30. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. There's more evidence this morning about the extent of modern slavery in the UK. The Salvation Army reports a huge increase in the number of people rescued from slavery after being forced to commit crimes. Many say their families were threatened. Enda Brady reports.
It's difficult to say that I was a slave. It sounds terrible. It feels terrible.
Dan was threatened, beaten and forced to sell drugs for a man who turned him into a modern-day slave. The ordeal only ended when Dan got arrested and police figured out what had been going on. In this interview filmed by the Salvation Army, he describes the abuse meted out by the man who had initially befriended him.
It was the threats of violence towards my loved ones that really was the hardest. Like when someone tells you that they're going to beat your mother up, that is, no man, no woman ever wants to hear that. It just made me feel terrified.
Shocking as it is, Dan's case is all too common a tale. 2,662 survivors of modern slavery in England and Wales were referred to the Salvation Army for help from July 2020 to June 2021. 470 had been forced to commit crimes such as growing or dealing drugs, begging and shoplifting. That's up 62%.
As a result of the pandemic, we have seen quite a significant increase in the number of individuals being referred into the national referral mechanism, which can be seen through either manners of county lines, forcing people or cuckooing apartments in order to continue with cannabis growth.
John Renouf is one of hundreds of Salvation Army volunteers who pick up victims of modern slavery and drive them to a safe house where they can get the help they need.
There are no stereotypes. You can't say it's limited to one particular nationality or one particular age group. We've moved people of wide age ranges from 18 through to their early 70s. I think the number of nationalities that have been helped is, I think, 70 or 80.
The economic and mental health impact of the pandemic may have made more people vulnerable to the kind of exploitation Dan suffered. As circumstances change, criminals adapt their methods to keep making money, no matter how much misery they cause. Enda Brady, Sky News.
Let's return to our top story now, and a former MI6 officer has told Sky News that some of Russia's leaders believe they're at war with the UK and they interfered with the Brexit and Scottish referendum campaigns. In his first British TV interview, Christopher Steele, the former spy behind a controversial dossier alleging collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, says there's growing Russian hostility to Britain. I'm joined now by the director of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, James Nixey. Good morning to you, Mr. Nixey. Let's look at this central claim to come out of the interview with Christopher Steele, that some Russian leaders believe they are at war with the UK. Is that how you would describe relations between Moscow and London?
That's entirely fair. The reason is because we shouldn't be thinking of war purely in military terms. If you think of war in terms of economic warfare, cyber warfare, diplomatic warfare as well, that as the Russians themselves do, then that does entirely make sense. So it's not as though the Russians are preparing for invasion. It's just that they see the undermining of the UK can be done with different, more efficient, more likely to be successful means than rolling over with tanks, which is clearly impossible. So when you look at the evidence, say in the financial sphere, for example, where quite clearly there's a clear degree of penetration into the financial sector with money of dubious Russian origin, which can be linked back to people within Putin's close or outer circle, then obviously there is a kind of attack underway. Now, how you want to define that precisely, whether you want to define it as war or conflict, or the need to undermine, the need to reduce the UK's influence at to increase Russia's influence at the expense of the UK's, doesn't really matter. The reality is that the Russians are trying a number of different tactics from their toolbox in order to make their own foreign policy goals successful.
And with then Russian hostility growing, what of the government's response? Christopher Steele alleges that the government's not taking it seriously enough. We've heard from former National Security Advisor Lord Sedwill, who says every senior politician that I've dealt with, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, whatever, takes any kind of this threat like this really seriously. They take national security seriously. They worry about the impact on the democratic process. They're right to do so. Who's right? Is Britain not taking it seriously enough, or is the threat being faced up to?
Well, I don't see the claims of Mr. Sedwill and Mr. Steele to be entirely contradictory for what it's worth. Both are saying that there is a threat to national security here. They may disagree on some of the detail, but I would suggest that after the Russia report released last year, then relatively little action has been taken by the UK government on that, particularly, again, if I may bring it up again, in the financial sphere. So whilst when there are specific, more visceral attempts by Russia to interfere in UK society and in the democratic process, and I'm thinking of radiological and chemical weapons attacks, then clearly there is a sort of a muscular response to that in some respects. Then with the financial undermining and the ability of Russian oligarchs, those close to Putin, to inveigle themselves into UK society, then that does clearly seem to be a case which this current party, this current government, and actually many of its predecessors, if not most of its predecessors, have failed to address.
Now, Christopher Steele's also claimed that the UK government didn't want to face up to his dossier of claims about President Trump and about alleged collusion with Russia because he said it would be punished by the US. Theresa May, at the time, distancing the government from Christopher Steele, saying he was no longer a former intelligence officer working for Britain. But what of that point that Britain didn't face up to those claims because it was kind of scared of the US's response?
I think there's a great element of truth there. If you recall, then when Theresa May was Home Secretary, she did not wish to escalate the dispute after the Litvinenko case. Actually, sorry, that's not correct. After the initial invasion of the war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, because it was revealed in a document which was photographed with a long lens going into Downing Street, but the UK did not wish to damage trade and/or international relations with Russia. So that does suggest that there is fear of retribution of some kind. One might ask what that retribution might be, whether it's expelling UK businesses still active in Russia or UK personnel still active in Russia, as we've actually seen from a BBC correspondent who has had her visa removed. So I think it's right to worry about retribution, but it's not right to give in to blackmail. And you've got to reconcile those two slightly contradictory facts.
Yeah, and on that, Lord Sedwill also responded, saying the British government, both Theresa May and Boris Johnson, have said has to have a good relationship with the President of the United States, whoever that is, but because he, meaning Christopher Steele, didn't see action of the kind he was hoping to see, doesn't mean it wasn't taken seriously. Any allegation of that kind, of course, is, of course, investigated properly and professionally. Just one final thought from you, James, if I can. What about Christopher Steele's own credibility? Many of the claims in his dossier on the former President Trump have failed to be proven. He himself has said he's prepared to accept not everything in the dossier is 100% accurate. How credible is he?
Well, I think that's the important point. One doesn't have to agree with all the detail to understand that the basic thrust is correct. There is a threat. Russia is an actor which is looking to regain its seat at the top of the table in world affairs, and it can only do that, it sees it by, as Steele himself says, with this sort of zero-sum approach. So I have no idea if some of these details, which he has not been able to prove, are correct. And if he says to himself, then that does put further doubt onto it. But I don't think that's the important point. The important point is that the UK has failed to take the threat by Russia seriously in terms of its actions. Its words, its rhetoric is pretty good. It will call Russia a threat. It will call Russia a challenge. It will say it's the principal challenge even, but it's not able to necessarily put that into action when it comes to, in particular, the economic challenge posed by Russia.
OK, James Nixie, thank you. Now, these claims were made in an exclusive UK interview with Deborah Haynes speaking to Christopher Steele. We have put those claims to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and a spokesman for him has declined to comment on any of the allegations. You can see that full exclusive report from Deborah Haynes coming up at 9:30 here on Sky News Breakfast and throughout the day on Sky News. Time for the weather now. It is set to turn wetter and windier through the weekend as frontal systems move in off the Atlantic. It will be a chilly start this morning with a frost in the northeast, fog patches in the south and a few showers around western coasts and hills. Atlantic coasts of Ireland and the Western Isles will be windier and cloudier with patchy rain. Wet and windy weather will spread across Ireland, Northern Ireland and western Scotland through the day. The rest of Britain mostly fine. Still to come on Sky News Breakfast, we will take an in-depth look at the papers with the Sunday Mirror's political editor Nigel Nelson and the writer and academic Mo Lovett. Welcome back. It is time to take a look through Saturday's papers now. With us to review them today are the Sunday Mirror's political editor Nigel Nelson and the writer and academic Mo Lovett. Hello again to both of you. Nigel, we're going to look at the Express first, and it has coverage of yesterday's debate in the House of Lords on the assisted dying bill, with a particularly moving intervention from Frank Field, who was too ill to attend but sent a letter. Tell us what happened.
Yes, well, what Frank revealed was that he is himself terminally ill and as a result has changed his mind about assisted dying. He's now in favour of it. I was desperately sad to learn this because I've known Frank for years and like him very much. But as far as the bill goes, I can understand why opponents object to it, because it does have some flaws. And the principal one is the 6-month window to determine when an illness is terminal. Doctors often get this wrong, and what disability campaigners are worried about is that could be abused. So while I think it is a basic right for people to be able to choose when they should die, especially if they're in great pain, I think you have to get any legislation absolutely right. This bill won't pass because the government are not giving it time. But I do think further consideration should be given to bringing in some appropriate legislation which satisfies both parties.
Mo Lovett, we heard from the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who is against changes to the laws on safety grounds, protecting the vulnerable. Also, the Archbishop of Canterbury saying that it's not safe to change the law at this stage. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, can I just echo what Nigel said? It's very sad news about Frank Field. Actually, the debate in the House of Lords yesterday was very nuanced. It was very sensible. It was very sensitive. I think we still need more. I mean, one of the things that worries me, particularly in the Netherlands, where assisted suicide is legal, is that people who are suffering from autism, simple autism, have been put to death. And in Canada, again, a country which has legalised suicide, next year, if you're just mentally ill, you will be eligible for assisted suicide. So I think we need much more debate on this. And, you know, we can all have absolute compassion for people who are in pain and suffering. But actually, it's not one of the main reasons that people choose to go down this route. Actually being a burden and just feeling worthless to society is much more. So maybe we ought to look at that. Maybe we ought to look at palliative care and how we remind people who are ill that they're still human, still very valued part of our life, and do everything we can to support them. Because I think we need to live in a life-affirming society, and I worry that we're not at the moment, and this is a bad time to push through some legislation like this.
Mo, the Daily Mail, page 6 of the Daily Mail, a warning that we need to get jabbed in order to have a Christmas not via Zoom. And this is coming from Kate Bingham, the former head of the Vaccine Task Force.
Yeah, I mean, the headline is very stick, isn't it? Either get your jab or you'll have to face Christmas on Zoom. And a lot of us had quite a miserable Christmas last year. The article itself is a little more carrot, and it's an in-depth interview with, like you say, Dame Kate Bingham. And she reminds us all about how fantastic the vaccine rollout was, from the clinical trials that relied on 500,000 citizen to bring through. Have you lost me? To get the rollout ready, and 350 million doses came on stream within 6 months. She reminds us of all those queues of people around football stadiums and cathedrals, all dying to get their jabs, and how successful that was, to Margaret Keaton at 90 years old being the first person to get jabbed. Unfortunately, what's happening with the booster shots is a less pretty picture. So 55% of over 80s have been jabbed, 39% of over 75s, and only 29% of over 70s. And I do think that this is a problem where demand, I know my parents are all waiting for their booster jab and they haven't been offered it yet. They're both in the over 70 category. So there's certainly a demand to get the boosters, but you know, I think the government needs to put in plans to get this rolled out, because we do know with the Delta variant being more transmittable, and with the vaccine waning, the efficacy of the vaccine waning after about 6 months, that we are going to need these boosters going into winter. So yeah, the government needs to roll up its sleeve. But I don't like this kind of threat of Christmas hanging over us. I don't think that motivates people to do the right thing and go and get their booster jab.
The Eye, Nigel, saying scientists are telling the PM it's time for Britain's Plan B. The Prime Minister, though, resisting it at this stage.
Yes, and these are sage scientists whose advice he's meant to be following. He always said he would follow the science, but he seems to be resisting this. I might get a real pasting on Twitter for supporting the idea of bringing in Plan B now and more restrictions. But the reason for it is, it seems to me, this is the best way of avoiding further lockdowns. You've got to get real about this, and the figures in Britain are 50,000 odd people are infected a day. That's the highest in Western Europe. It compares with 9,000 in Germany, 5,000 in France, and 3,000 in Italy. We're way ahead of everybody else. And some of those people, whether vaccinated or not, will get very ill. A quarter of all critical care beds are now filled by COVID patients. And if this is not to get out of hand, we must get on top of it. And that is why Plan B and more restrictions are better to have now than another lockdown over Christmas.
I mean, critics argue on mask wearing that that's happening in Wales and the numbers are higher, but look at Scotland, where there are tougher restrictions, and of course the cases are coming down there. So we will have to see what happens after the half-term break, of course. Nigel, we're going to have a look in the mirror now at a story that you've picked out, which is about children's table manners. Now, this is a subject close to my own heart, but actually this story is making me feel better about my children's manners.
Yes, I mean, the Mirror is describing them as Neanderthal table manners, and anyone with teenage children will know that it is a bit like returning to the Stone Age. What this survey is showing is that 6 in 10 children are eating with their hands and licking their plates in a rather sort of Neanderthal fashion. Now, the reason given for this is that too many children now are watching their screens while they're eating, often disappearing to their bedrooms, and as a result, they don't see their parents eating properly with knives and forks. So I would rather think the answer to this is a bit of discipline in the home, which means not to stop children eating over their screens, but at least having one meal with parents.
Yeah, as we speak, I'm sure at least one of my children is drinking the cereal milk directly from the bowl. Nigel and Mo, and I'm not there to stop them. Thank you both very much indeed. More coming up in the next hour here on Sky News Breakfast.